The massive doors of Kepler Station hissed open as Captain Lee stepped onto the main plaza. The sight before him was breathtaking, yet overwhelming. Thousands of beings from across the galaxy moved like a living river through the enormous space. The plaza stretched so wide that he could barely see the far walls, and the ceiling disappeared into artificial clouds that mimicked a real sky. Krellian merchants scuttled past on their 6 powerful legs, their carapaces clicking against the metal floor as they carried glowing trade goods. Their insect-like faces showed no emotion as they pushed through smaller beings without care. Above them, the ethereal diplomats drifted like living mist, their translucent forms shimmering as they phased in and out of solid matter. They spoke in haunting musical tones that made Lee's skin tingle. Tall, elegant Velari delegates glided by, with their crystalline skin catching the station's artificial sunlight. They moved with perfect grace, their faces set in expressions of cold dignity. Behind them came the hulking granite warriors, each one standing nearly 8 feet tall with skin like living stone. Their heavy footsteps made the floor vibrate slightly. Lee had been to many spaceports before, but nothing compared to this. The air hummed with energy from a dozen different technologies. Strange smells mixed together, ozone from energy weapons, exotic spices from distant worlds, and the metallic tang of recycled atmosphere. Languages he had never heard created a constant background noise of clicks, whistles, and harmonic tones, but something caught his attention that made him stop walking. In the exact center of all this chaos, where the foot traffic was heaviest, sat a small figure that everyone seemed to ignore. Lee squinted through the crowd and felt his heart sink. It was a young Velari girl, probably no older than 16 in human years. She sat on the cold metal floor with her knees pulled up to her chest, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Her crystalline skin, which should have been bright and clear, flickered weakly like a dying light bulb. Tears rolled down her face and hit the ground, where they formed tiny puddles that reflected the passing aliens above. What shocked Lee most was how everyone treated her. The Krellian merchants stepped right over her legs without slowing down. Some even used her as a landmark, telling their companions to turn left at the crying creature. The ethereal diplomat simply floated through the space above her head, as if she didn't exist at all. Even worse, when other Velari passed by, they quickly looked away and hurried past faster, their crystalline faces showing disgust and embarrassment. Lee watched a particularly large Krellian actually step on the girl's foot as he passed. She cried out in pain, but the merchant didn't even notice. A group of young Velari nearby whispered to each other and pointed at her with obvious shame, as if her tears were somehow contaminating the air around them. The human captain felt anger rising in his chest. In all his years traveling through space, he had seen many strange customs and behaviors from different species. He understood that not every culture valued the same things humans did. But this was different. This wasn't just cultural difference. This was cruelty through indifference. His fellow human officers were already heading toward their assigned diplomatic quarters, focused on their important mission to negotiate new trade agreements. They had meetings to attend, schedules to keep, and political relationships to maintain. The logical thing would be to follow them and ignore the girl like everyone else was doing. But Lee couldn't move. Something deep inside him, something fundamentally human, refused to let him walk past someone who was clearly suffering. Lee walked through the crowd toward the crying girl, his boots echoing on the metal floor. The closer he got, the more he could see how young she really was. Her crystalline skin was cracked in several places, probably from dehydration and stress. Her clothes were torn and dirty, suggesting she had been living on the streets for days. Knelt down in front of her, ignoring the strange looks from passing aliens. His universal standard wasn't perfect. Most humans struggled with the complex grammar, but he did his best. "Are you okay?" he asked slowly, pronouncing each word carefully. The girl's head snapped up so fast that Lee worried she might hurt her neck. Her large violet eyes were wide with complete shock, as if she couldn't believe someone had actually spoken to her. For a moment she just stared at him without blinking, her mouth slightly open. You talk to me?" she whispered in broken universal standard, her voice hoarse from crying. Lee nodded gently. Yes, what's wrong? Why are you crying? The girl looked around nervously, as if she expected someone to punish her for having this conversation. When she saw that Lee was genuinely waiting for an answer, tears started flowing down her face again. No one talked to me for 3 days, she said, struggling with the words. I sit here and everyone walk like I'm invisible. Lee felt his anger growing, but he kept his voice calm and gentle. What's your name? Neera, she said quietly. My name is Neera. I'm Lee. Nice to meet you, Neera. She looked confused by this. Simple politeness, as if no one had ever been nice to her before. Around them, other aliens were starting to notice their conversation. A group of Krellian merchants stopped walking and began clicking their mandibles together in what Lee recognized as disapproval. Their large compound eyes focused on him with obvious annoyance. Why do you waste time with Broken One? One of the Krellians asked in heavily accented Universal Standard. She is defective, no use for anything. Lee ignored them and kept his attention on Neera. Why are you here alone? Where is your family? Neera's expression became even sadder. She pointed up toward the ceiling, in the direction of the docking bays where ships from her homeworld would arrive. They send me away, she said. I cannot go home ever. Why? Lee asked gently. Neera struggled to find the right words in Universal Standard. She made gestures with her hands, trying to explain something complex. Finally, she seemed to give up. On words and simply showed him. She reached into her torn pocket and pulled out something small. It was a tiny dead creature that looked like a cross between a bird and a butterfly. Its wings were transparent and delicate, and its small body was covered in soft, colorful fur. It was dying, Neera said, cradling the creature gently. On my world we have rule. When something dies, we walk away, we do not touch, we do not feel sad, but I could not leave it alone. I held it when it died. I cried for it. Lee understood immediately. On her world, showing emotion or compassion was forbidden. She had been exiled for the simple act of comforting a dying animal. By now, more aliens had gathered around them. Ethereal diplomats floated nearby, their forms shimmering with what Lee recognized as confusion. They spoke to each other in their musical language, clearly discussing the strange human who was wasting time on a worthless exile. A tall Velari official approached them, his crystalline skin perfectly clear and bright, showing his high status. He looked down at Neera with obvious disgust. Human, he said to Lee in perfect Universal Standard. You should not speak with this one. She is contaminated with emotion sickness. She might spread it to you. Lee looked up at the official, then back at Neera, who was now trembling with fear. The choice was simple. He could stand up, apologize, and walk away to avoid causing diplomatic problems, or he could do what felt right. Lee sat down on the cold metal floor next to Neera. I think I'll stay here, he said calmly. Within minutes, Lee heard familiar footsteps approaching. He looked up to see Lieutenant Kim jogging toward them, her face full of concern. She had been heading to their assigned quarters when she noticed Lee wasn't with the group. Captain, what's going on? Kim asked, then saw Neera sitting beside him. Her expression immediately softened. Oh my God, is she hurt? She's been exiled from her home, Lee explained quietly. She's been alone here for 3 days. Kim didn't hesitate. She knelt down on Neera's other side and gently touched the girl's shoulder. Hey there, sweetheart. Are you thirsty? Neera looked between the two humans with amazement, as if she couldn't believe two people were actually being kind to her. Kim pulled out her water bottle and offered it to the girl. Neera's hand shook as she accepted it and took small, careful sips. Soon more human voices could be heard approaching. Sergeant Park appeared first, carrying his emergency ration pack. Behind him came engineers Han and Choi, along with medical. Officer Jung. They had noticed their missing colleagues and come looking. What's the situation? Park asked. But when he saw Neera, his military training kicked in. He immediately assessed that she was malnourished and dehydrated. Without being asked, he opened his rations and started preparing a simple meal. She needs medical attention, Jung said quietly after looking at Neera's cracked skin and sunken eyes. When did she last eat? Through broken universal standard and gentle gestures, they learned that Nira had been surviving on scraps and rainwater that collected in the station's drainage systems. The humans were horrified, but they didn't show it in front of her. Instead, they simply took action. Within an hour, all 7 members of the human diplomatic team had gathered around Nira. They sat in a loose circle on the plaza floor, completely ignoring the stares and comments from passing aliens. Han had found a blanket in their supplies. Choi was teaching Nira simple words in human languages while she ate Park's carefully prepared food. Jung was quietly treating the worst cracks in her crystalline skin with basic first aid. The alien observers were becoming more numerous and vocal. A group of Krellian traders had stopped their business to watch this strange spectacle. Their clicking grew louder and more agitated. Illogical behavior, one of them announced to his companions. Wasting resources on damaged goods. Humans must have brain defects. The ethereal diplomats floated in a wide circle around the humans, their musical voices creating an eerie harmony as they discussed what they were witnessing. They couldn't understand why anyone would sacrifice efficiency for emotional comfort. But the most interesting reaction came from the Calith hive mind representative. This massive insect-like creature, with a dozen arms and multiple heads, stood perfectly still for nearly 10 minutes, processing what it was seeing. Finally, it spoke. In its mechanical voice, calculation complete. Resource expenditure high, logical benefit 0, classification waste of energy. Recommendation: discontinue behavior immediately. The humans completely ignored these comments. They were too busy making sure Nira was comfortable and safe. However, something unexpected began to happen. While the adult aliens continued to express disapproval, some of the younger ones started behaving differently. A small Krellian, probably an adolescent, stopped walking and stared at the scene for a long time. Its compound eyes focused particularly on how gently the humans were treating Nira. A young ethereal broke away from its group and floated closer, its form flickering with what might have been curiosity. It spoke to its elders in musical tones, but they quickly called it back with sharp, discordant notes. Most surprising of all, a teenage Valari girl watched from behind a support pillar. Her crystalline skin was flickering with emotions she was clearly trying to hide. When her parents noticed her watching, they grabbed her arm and pulled her away, but not before Lee saw tears forming in her violet eyes. The human's simple act of kindness was creating ripples throughout the station in ways they couldn't have predicted. As the hours passed, Lee began to notice something strange about Nira. Every time a group of aliens walked by, she would flinch or react in ways that didn't match what was actually happening. When a Krellian merchant passed while arguing with his partner, Nira suddenly looked angry even though no one was speaking to her. When an ethereal diplomat floated by looking calm on the outside, Nira started trembling with fear. "Nira," Lee said gently, "what's happening? Why do you look scared when that ethereal went by?" Nira looked confused, as if she didn't understand the question. "He is very afraid," she said simply. "Afraid? But he looked perfectly calm to me." "No," Nira shook her head firmly. "Inside he feels terror. He thinks Krellians will attack his ship tomorrow. He tries to hide it, but I feel what he feels." Lee's eyes widened. He looked at Kim, who had been listening to their conversation. She raised her eyebrows, clearly thinking the same thing he was. "Nira," Kim said carefully, "can you feel what all of them are feeling? All the different species?" Nira nodded, as if this was perfectly normal. "Yes, always. That is why my people sent me away. They say it is mutation. Very dangerous. Makes me weak and sick." Over the next few hours, the humans tested Nira's ability carefully. She could accurately describe the emotions of every alien that passed by, even when their faces and body language showed nothing. A Krellian who looked angry was actually deeply sad about losing his family. An ethereal who appeared confident was terrified of failing an important mission. A stoic builder who seemed emotionless was burning with curiosity about human behavior. That evening, when the plaza was quieter, Lee sat with his team to discuss what they had learned. They spoke in hushed English, so Nira, who was sleeping peacefully, for the first time in days, wouldn't be disturbed. "This changes everything," whispered Jung. If she can really feel what other species are thinking and feeling, she could be the key to understanding them, Park finished. Real understanding, not just translation. Lee nodded grimly. And we need that understanding now, more than ever. The team had been sent to Kepler Station for urgent diplomatic work. The Krellian Empire and the Ethereal Collective were preparing for war. Again, these two powerful civilizations had been enemies for over 300 years, fighting battle after battle across dozens of star systems. Millions had died in their conflicts. The problem was simple. They couldn't understand each other. Krellians were physical beings who expressed everything through action and aggression. They saw the Ethereals' calm, peaceful nature as weakness and deception. The Ethereals were energy-based life forms who valued harmony and quiet thought. They saw Krellian aggression as primitive and dangerous. Every peace treaty had failed because neither side could truly believe the other's intentions. When Krellians said they wanted peace, Ethereals heard lies. When Ethereals spoke of harmony, Krellians heard threats. The war fleets are already gathering, Han said quietly. Our intelligence reports say both sides are preparing for the biggest battle in their history. If it happens, entire planets could be destroyed. Lee looked down at Neera, who was curled up in the blanket they had given her. She looked so young and fragile, but inside her mind was a gift that could potentially save millions of lives. If she could help them understand each other's real feelings, he began. It could stop the war, Kim finished. But Lee, think about what that would mean for her. She'd have to experience the emotions of entire fleets, all that anger, fear, hatred and pain from both sides. It could kill her, Jung added bluntly. The human mind can barely handle human emotions sometimes. What would all that alien rage and terror do to her? Lee ran his hands through his hair, feeling the weight of an impossible decision. They had found the one person in the galaxy who might be able to prevent a catastrophic war, but using her gift could destroy her completely. The emergency meeting was called at dawn. Lee sat in the sterile conference room, surrounded by alien diplomats from across the galaxy, but his mind kept drifting to Neera, who was still sleeping in the medical bay where Jung had taken her for proper care. The Krellian. War Commander slammed his armored fist on the metal table, making everyone jump. Enough talk. The Ethereals have moved their battle fleet to the border. This is an act of war. We moved our ships for defensive purposes only, the Ethereal ambassador replied in her haunting musical voice. Her translucent form flickered with what looked like frustration. Your people have been attacking our trade routes for months. Lies! The Krellian shouted. We defend ourselves from your sneak attacks. Lee watched this exchange with growing despair. Both sides were absolutely convinced the other was lying. The Krellian's compound eyes showed nothing but rage and suspicion. The Ethereal's form pulsed with fear and righteous anger. Neither could see past their own emotions to understand the other's perspective. The session went on for hours, getting worse instead of better. By midday, the Krellian delegation had stormed out, threatening to launch their attack within 48 hours. The Ethereals declared they would defend themselves with total force, which everyone knew meant they would use their planet-killing energy weapons. That afternoon, Lee found himself alone with the senior diplomats from the neutral species. The Valari Chancellor, an ancient being with perfectly clear crystalline skin, looked at him with cold calculation. Captain Lee, she said, we understand you have been associating with one of our defective individuals. Her name is Neera, Lee replied firmly. Yes, we also understand this individual possesses certain mutations that some might consider useful in our current situation. Lee's heart began racing. Word had gotten out about Neera's abilities. The Kaleth Hive Mind representative spoke. Next, its mechanical voice emotionless. Calculation suggests the defective one could facilitate understanding between warring parties. Recommend immediate utilization. Absolutely not, Lee said quickly. She's just a child. Child? The Valari Chancellor looked confused. She is a resource, a tool that could prevent war. The logical choice is simple. Logic is not simple when... We're talking about someone's life, Lee shot back. The stoic builder delegate, a massive creature made of living stone, rumbled to life. Individual survival is less important than collective survival. Mathematics is clear. One life versus millions of lives. Lee felt sick. These beings couldn't understand that Neera wasn't just a tool to be used and discarded. To them, she was defective, worthless except for this one ability. They had no concept of her value as a living being who deserved protection and care. The process would likely destroy her mind, Lee explained desperately. She'd have to experience the raw emotions of entire battle fleets. All that hatred, fear, and rage would pour through her consciousness at once. Acceptable losses. The chai. Hive mind calculated coldly. Not acceptable to me, Lee said, standing up from the table. As he walked back to the medical bay, Lee's mind was tormented by the impossible choice before him. In less than 2 days, the largest space battle in galactic history would begin. Entire planets would be reduced to ash. Billions of innocent people would die in the crossfire, and he had the key to stopping it all. When he reached the medical bay, he found Neera sitting up in bed, looking much better after proper food and rest. Her crystalline skin was beginning to heal, and her violet eyes were brighter. She smiled when she saw him, the first real smile he had seen from her. "Captain Lee," she said happily, "the doctor says I'm getting stronger." Lee sat down beside her bed, his heart breaking. Here was a girl who had been abandoned, exiled, and treated like garbage by everyone she had ever known. The only kindness she had experienced in her entire life came from strangers who had known her for just a few days. And now he had to decide whether to ask her to sacrifice everything for the very species that had thrown her away. Lee spent the entire night walking the empty corridors of Kepler Station, wrestling with his conscience. By morning he had made his decision, but it wasn't the one anyone expected. He found Neera in the medical bay practicing her universal standard with Jung, who was teaching her new words while checking her vital signs. When she saw Lee, her face lit up with that innocent smile that made his heart ache. "Neera," he said gently, sitting down across from her. "I need to tell you something important." Her smile faded as she sensed the seriousness in his voice. "What is wrong, Captain Lee?" Lee explained everything. The coming war, the millions who would die, and how her gift might be the only way to stop it. He was completely honest about the risks, about how the emotional trauma from both fleets could destroy her mind completely. When he finished, Neera was quiet for a long time. Finally, she looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "If I do this, maybe the dying will stop?" she asked quietly. "Maybe," Lee said. "But Neera, I can't ask you to sacrifice yourself for people who treated you so badly." "But what about all the children?" she whispered. "On both sides. They will die too if the war happens." Lee felt his throat tighten. Even after everything she had been through, Neera's first thought was about protecting others. "There might be another way," he said slowly. "But it's never been tried before, and I don't know if it will work." Jung looked up from her medical scanner, curious. "What if you didn't have to carry that emotional burden alone?" Lee continued. "What if we could share it with you?" Neera looked confused. "Share? How?" "Humans have something called empathy," Lee explained. "We can feel what others feel, though not as strongly as you can. If we could connect our minds to yours, maybe we could help absorb some of the emotional trauma." Jung's eyes widened. "Lee, that's incredibly dangerous. We don't know how human minds would react to alien emotions channeled through Velari abilities." "It's less dangerous than asking her to do it alone," Lee replied firmly. Within an hour, Lee had gathered his entire team. He explained his plan to Kim, Park, Han, Choi, and the others. The room fell silent as they absorbed what he was asking. "So basically," Park said slowly, "you want us to link our minds together and experience the raw emotions of 2 entire battle fleets that have been hating each other for centuries." "That's exactly what I'm asking," Lee admitted. "It could drive us insane," Han pointed out. "It could kill us," Choi added. "The aliens are right about one thing," Kim said quietly. "It does sound like madness," Lee nodded. "I won't order anyone to do this. It has to be completely voluntary. If you want to refuse, I'll understand completely." The team exchanged glances. Then, one by one, they began to speak. "I'm in," Kim said without hesitation. Me too, Park added immediately. Count me in, said Han. And me, Choi nodded. Jung looked up from her medical notes. Someone will need to monitor everyone's vital signs during the process. I volunteer. Within minutes, all 7 humans had agreed to share the burden with Neera. When word reached the alien diplomats, their reactions were exactly what Lee expected. The Krellian war commander clicked his mandibles in disbelief. Humans will destroy their own minds for stranger child. This makes no sense. The ethereal ambassador's form flickered rapidly with confusion. Such sacrifice for unrelated individual defies all logic. The Valari Chancellor was the most direct. Your species appears to have a fundamental flaw in survival instincts. But Lee noticed something else in their reactions. Beneath the confusion and criticism, some of the aliens seemed almost impressed. A few of the younger ones watched the humans with something that might have been admiration. The Kaleth hive mind spent several minutes calculating before speaking. Emotional sharing concept does not compute. Recommend immediate psychological evaluation of all humans. We're not crazy, Lee told them calmly. We're just not willing to let a child face this alone. As the humans began preparing for the mind link procedure, alien observers gathered to watch what they were calling the greatest act of foolishness in galactic history. The humans called it something else entirely. Hope. The preparation took 12 hours. Jung worked frantically to set up monitoring equipment for all 8 participants, while the other humans tried to mentally prepare themselves for something no one in galactic history had ever attempted. Neera sat quietly in the center of the medical bay, surrounded by portable brain scanners and heart monitors. The humans formed a circle around her, each one connected to medical sensors that would track their vital signs during the procedure. Remember, Jung said as she made final adjustments to the equipment, if anyone's readings go into the danger zone, I'm pulling the plug immediately. We're not losing anyone today. Lee looked around at his team. Kim was trying to hide her nervousness by checking her equipment over and over. Park sat in meditation position, attempting to calm his mind. Han and Choi were quietly discussing what they might experience, while the others simply sat in contemplative silence. Outside the medical bay, dozens of alien observers had gathered. They pressed against the windows, watching the humans prepare for what they considered collective suicide. Some were taking bets on how quickly the humans' minds would break. Are you ready? Lee asked Neera gently. She nodded, though her hands were shaking slightly. I think so. But Captain Lee, what if I hurt you? What if my gift is too strong for human minds? Then we'll figure it out together, Kim said firmly. That's what humans do. We face problems as a team. The psychic link began slowly. Neera reached out with her empathic abilities, but instead of connecting directly to the warring fleets, she first connected to the humans around her. Lee felt a strange, tingling sensation in his mind, as if someone was gently touching his thoughts. Then he began to feel what the others were feeling. Kim's determination mixed with her hidden fear. Park's calm strength covering his deep worry for Neera. Han's curiosity about the process battling his concern for everyone's safety. It was overwhelming at first, but not painful, more like being in a room where everyone was talking at once. I can feel you all, Neera whispered, her eyes wide with wonder. Your minds are so warm, so full of caring for each other. Now comes the hard part, Lee said softly. Reach out to the fleets, but remember, you're not alone. We're with you. Neera closed her eyes and extended her abilities toward the Krellian and ethereal battle fleets positioned at the edge of the system. The change was immediate and shocking. Suddenly, Lee's mind was flooded with emotions that didn't belong to him. Rage so pure it felt like fire burning through his thoughts. Fear so deep it made his whole body shake. Hatred built up over centuries of conflict, mixed with grief for countless friends and family members lost in previous battles. But the emotions weren't just his. They were shared among all 8 minds in the link. Instead of destroying any single person, the overwhelming feelings were divided, made manageable by being spread across multiple consciousness. Through the link, Lee began to understand what each side was really feeling beneath their public facades. The Krelian fleet wasn't just angry. They were terrified. For generations they had watched their young warriors leave for battle against the mysterious ethereals, never to return. They fought so aggressively because they believed it was the only way to protect their families. Their hatred came from fear of extinction. The ethereal fleet wasn't cold or calculating. They were heartbroken. They had tried for centuries to communicate their peaceful intentions, only to be met with violence every time. They saw themselves as protectors of harmony in the universe, forced into war by beings who seemed to understand only destruction. But something unprecedented began to happen. Through Nira's gift and the humans' shared empathy, the emotions began to flow both ways. For the first time in their history, Krelian minds touched ethereal consciousness directly. The war commander, sitting in his flagship preparing for battle, suddenly felt the profound sadness of the ethereal admiral, not just her tactical concerns, but her genuine grief over the young ethereals who would die in the coming battle. Meanwhile, ethereal minds experienced Krelian emotions without the filter of aggression. The admiral felt the war commander's desperate love for his children back home, his crushing responsibility for the lives of thousands of warriors under his command. In the medical bay, tears began flowing down faces that had never cried before. Nira was weeping openly, but so were several of the humans. Even Jung, who was supposed to be monitoring the equipment, found herself crying as waves of shared emotion washed through the room. The breakthrough came when both fleet commanders experienced the same memory simultaneously, children playing on their respective worlds, laughing and running without any knowledge of the ancient hatred between their species. For the first time in 300 years, Krelian and ethereal minds truly understood each other. The change began in the command centers of both fleets, thousands of kilometers away from Kepler Station. War Commander Zekthul was reviewing his final attack plans when the emotional connection hit him like a physical blow. For the first time in his life, he felt what his enemies actually felt, not the cold calculation he had imagined, but genuine terror and sadness. His armored hands shook as he stared at the holographic display showing ethereal ships. These weren't monsters plotting his people's destruction. They were beings just like him, trying to protect their families and preserve their way of life. On the ethereal flagship, Admiral Velthara experienced something equally shocking. The aggressive thoughts she detected from the Krelian fleet weren't born from evil or hatred, but from desperate fear. These warriors truly believed they were defending their children from extinction. Back in the medical bay, the psychic link was growing stronger by the minute. Lee could feel the exact moment when understanding dawned in both commanders' minds. The shift was so powerful that even the alien observers outside began to notice something was happening. "Look at the tactical displays," whispered a Valari official, pointing to the public screens showing fleet positions. The Krelian attack formation was changing. Ships that had been arranged in aggressive strike patterns were slowly moving into defensive positions. Weapon systems that had been charging for the past 48 hours began powering down one by one. The ethereal response was equally dramatic. Their battle formations dissolved as ships moved out of combat readiness. Energy weapons that could crack planets went dark as their crews received new orders. Inside the link, Nira was struggling to maintain the connection. Sweat poured down her face as she channeled emotions from thousands of minds across both fleets. But every time she started to weaken, she felt the strength of the humans around her holding her up. "We've got you," Kim whispered, though her own face was pale with exhaustion. "Don't give up now." The breakthrough came when War Commander Zekthul did something unprecedented in Krelian history. He opened a direct communication channel to the ethereal admiral, but instead of issuing threats or demands, he spoke from his heart. "Admiral Velthara," his voice was rough with emotion, I can feel your sadness. For the first time, I understand. You have lost children in our wars too." The admiral's response was equally unprecedented. Instead of the formal musical tones typical of ethereal diplomacy, her voice carried raw emotion. "Commander, I feel your fear for your people. We have been so wrong about each other for so long." The conversation that followed was broadcast live across both fleets. Thousands of warriors on both sides listened in amazement as their leaders spoke to each other with genuine understanding for the first time in 3 centuries. "We have a choice," the Admiral said finally. "We can honor our children by continuing this cycle of death, or we can choose to build something better." "I choose peace," Zekthul replied immediately. "For all our children." Within minutes, ceasefire orders went out to both fleets. Weapons systems shut down completely. Ships that had been ready to unleash devastating attacks instead began transmitting messages of hope, but the effort had cost them dearly. In the medical bay, Nira suddenly collapsed, her crystalline skin flickering weakly as the psychic link finally broke. Jung rushed to her side, checking vital signs while the human slowly returned to normal consciousness. "Is she?" Lee asked frantically, his own mind still reeling from the experience. "She's alive," Jung said with relief. "Exhausted and dehydrated, but alive. Her brain activity is stable." One by one, the humans helped each other to their feet. They were all mentally and physically drained, but they had done something that would be remembered forever. They had prevented a war that could have destroyed entire civilizations. Park was the first to notice the crowds gathering outside the medical bay. Alien faces were pressed against every window, but their expressions had changed completely. Instead of skepticism and dismissal, there was something new in their eyes: respect. "They actually did it," whispered a young Krellian to his companion. "The humans really shared the pain to save strangers." "Impossible," an ethereal delegate murmured to herself. "Such sacrifice for others defies all logic, yet here we witness it." As news of the ceasefire spread throughout Kepler Station, something extraordinary began to happen. Aliens who had dismissed human emotion as weakness were now asking questions about empathy and compassion. The simple act of refusing to let someone suffer alone had created ripples that were spreading across the galaxy. 6 months after the ceasefire, Lee stood on the observation deck of what used to be Kepler Station's main plaza. The space had been completely transformed. Where once there had been only cold metal floors and rushing crowds of indifferent aliens, now there were comfortable seating areas, gardens with plants from dozens of worlds, and quiet spaces designed for reflection and conversation. The biggest change, however, was in the beings themselves. Lee watched as a young Krellian sat across from an ethereal student, both of them practicing something that would have been unthinkable just months ago. They were learning to understand each other's emotions. "It's incredible, isn't it?" Kim said, joining Lee at the observation window. She was wearing the new uniform of the Interspecies Empathy Council, a simple design that represented unity rather than any single species authority. "Sometimes I still can't believe it really happened," Lee replied, watching as more students arrived for their daily sessions. The Empathy Council had been Nira's idea. As word of the successful peace process spread throughout the galaxy, leaders from dozens of species had contacted Kepler Station, asking to learn more about this revolutionary approach to conflict resolution. Instead of treaties based on fear and mutual threats, they wanted to try building relationships based on actual understanding. Nira herself had become something of a legend. The girl who had once been exiled for showing compassion was now the most respected figure on the station. She moved through the crowds with quiet confidence, no longer the broken child crying alone on the plaza floor. "Director Nira," Lee called out as she approached their observation area. She had insisted that everyone call her by her title now. Not out of ego, but because it helped the alien students understand that emotional intelligence was just as valuable as any other kind of expertise. "Captain Lee," she smiled, her crystalline skin bright and healthy. "How are our newest students doing?" "See for yourself," Kim said, pointing down to the main floor. Below them, an unprecedented scene was unfolding. A group of young Kaleth, members of the species that had once dismissed emotions as calculation errors, were working with human counselors to understand the concept of grief. They had lost several hive members in a recent accident and were struggling to process feelings they had never been taught to recognize. Nearby, a teenage Valari was teaching a group of mixed-species students about emotional control. Not suppression, as her people had practiced for millennia, but healthy management of feelings. Her parents, who had once been ashamed of her emotional nature, now proudly watched from the visitor gallery. The most remarkable sight was in the center of the space, where former War Commander Zekthul and ex-Admiral Velthara worked together. As co-instructors for the Advanced Conflict Resolution Program, they taught students from both their species about the dangers of assuming the worst about others, using their own centuries-long misunderstanding as a cautionary tale. "The application list gets longer every day," Nira said with satisfaction. "We have requests from species I've never even heard of, all wanting to learn about empathy and emotional connection." Lee shook his head in amazement. "And to think it all started because you couldn't walk past someone who was crying." "No," Nira corrected gently. "It started because you couldn't walk past someone who was crying. My people taught me that caring was weakness. Your people taught me that caring was strength." As they watched, a small commotion broke out near the entrance. A young alien Lee didn't recognize, some kind of reptilian species with silver scales, had fallen and scraped his knee. Instead of ignoring him or stepping over him as would have happened in the old days, several students from different species immediately rushed to help. A Krellian carefully examined the injury, while an ethereal provided emotional comfort. A human student called for medical assistance, and even a typically stoic builder offered to carry the injured student to the medical center. "That's what I wanted to see," Nira said softly. "Not just understanding between enemies, but kindness between strangers." The success stories kept coming. The Krellian Empire and Ethereal Collective had not only maintained their ceasefire, but had begun joint exploration missions, discovering that their different approaches to problem-solving actually complemented each other perfectly. Trade between. Their territories had increased by over 300%, and for the first time in centuries, young people from both species were choosing careers in diplomacy rather than warfare. Even more importantly, other conflicts throughout the galaxy were being resolved. Using the Kepler model, empathic bridging facilitated by trained emotional interpreters, wars that had raged for decades were ending not through conquest, but through understanding. Lee's communication device chimed with an urgent message. He glanced at it and smiled. "What is it?" Kim asked. "New assignment," Lee said. "The Galactic Council wants our team to help establish empathy centers on 12 more stations. Apparently, the demand for human emotional expertise is higher than they ever imagined." Nira laughed, a sound that still amazed Lee after all these months. The girl who had once been afraid to show any emotion was now teaching others to embrace their feelings as sources of strength rather than shame. "Will you go?" she asked. Lee looked down at the thriving community they had helped create, then back at his team members who had become more than colleagues. They had become family. "We'll go," he said finally, "but we'll be back. This is home now." As the artificial sun set over Kepler Station, Lee reflected on how a simple act of kindness had changed the galaxy. The greatest weapon against hatred wasn't superior firepower or brilliant strategy. It was the willingness to sit down beside someone who was hurting and ask, "What's wrong?" Sometimes that was all it took to change everything.